She was about to stand and leave the coffee shop, convinced she had spent an hour on the wrong kind of small talk, until a little voice from the doorway said something that stopped her mid-step and turned everything upside down. The room smelled of roasted beans and lemon soap. Light slid through the tall windows like warm honey, and the low murmur of conversation was punctuated by the clink of spoons against china. Claire Walker sat at a corner table, coat draped over the chair back, fingers wrapped around a warm cup that steamed against the late afternoon air. She had learned to recognize the pattern of disappointment, the polite smiles that never reached the eyes, the polite questions that felt like rehearsed gates. This was supposed to be another casual try, another data point to file away in the ledger of what might be possible. It was her 5th date in 2 months, and she had arrived ready to be turned off. Across from her, a man walked in with work boots that still held the faint dust of sawdust and earth. He carried a satchel that smelled faintly of cedar and lemon oil. His laugh was quick and half-surprised. His hands moved with a confident, unhurried rhythm. Ethan Brooks said hello as if he meant it, sat down as if he had nowhere better to be, and introduced himself without pretense. Claire noticed the small things the way she always did now. The calluses on his fingers, the way he smoothed his sleeves without thinking, the dimples that appeared when he tried to be serious. He spoke of his business, a tiny woodshop in the old district, of making cradles and shelves, and restoring the kind of pieces that held memories. She answered with the practiced lines that made her seem interested while measuring the distance between their worlds. It was supposed to be a simple exchange about favorite books and weekend routines. Then a bell over the door chimed and a small figure zipped in as if pulled by a string. A girl with a red hat, cheeks already pink from the cold, barreled toward Ethan and shouted a single word in a voice that made the air crack open. "Daddy!" She launched herself onto his lap and then, without ceremony, handed Claire a folded piece of paper. The drawing was quick and exuberant, a sun with too many rays, a house with 3 lopsided windows, and a woman figure with wild yellow hair holding a small book. The girl looked up with a certainty that made Claire blink. "You are the lady from Daddy's story," she said, and the sentence felt like a verdict and a gift at once. Claire swallowed, and the cup trembled in her hands. She had been ready to catalog another mismatch, to make polite notes and leave, but the paper changed the geometry of the table. The scent of lemon oil from Ethan shifted into something kinder, like old wood polished by patient hands. The sound of the shop bell blended into the low piano coming from the corner. For the first time that afternoon, Claire felt curiosity outweigh precaution. She began to listen to the story that was already being offered to her, and she felt warmth uncoil somewhere she had kept carefully curled. Claire was a freelance pastry stylist who had spent most of her adult life arranging other people's celebrations into perfection. She was someone who knew how to make an event look inevitable. Growing up in a small coastal town, she had learned that appearances could smooth over awkwardness, that a well-placed ribbon could make transitions easier. She had gone to culinary school, worked late nights under fluorescent lights, and built a reputation for quiet excellence. Her home was neat and light-filtered, a place where everything had its place, and a tea towel folded like a promise. Underneath the calm, there was a long, familiar ache. Her marriage had ended 3 years earlier, soft at first and then blunt, with a silence that spread between 2 people like spilled milk. She had custody of nothing more than a worn mixing spoon and a box of photos. When she dated, she kept the conversation on art and travel, steering clear of anything that asked for an inventory of wounds. The last years had taught her a cautious kind of hope, practical and small, like saving for a trip you may or may not take. Ethan had his own backstory, one made of steady mornings and loud bird calls. He had been raised by his grandmother Ruth in a house that smelled of pine and chicken soup, learning to carve spoons before he learned to tie his shoes. After high school, he apprenticed with a furniture maker named Marcus, who taught him the dignity of restoring what others considered scrap. He had married young, believing in the tidy arc of family, and he had been a devoted father until grief rethreaded his life in an unexpected way. His wife had died 2 years earlier, in a hospital corridor too bright for mourning, and since then he had become both shelter and lighthouse for his daughter Sophie. He ran a small workshop that doubled as a community project, where neighbors like Carlos and Lena sometimes brought in broken chairs and left with a little more of themselves mended. He believed in stories as tools for keeping fear company, and he told Sophie a bedtime tale about a woman with hair like sunlight who always found a way to warm a cold night. Ethan had kept that story alive in the way he hummed while sanding and in the little carved bird he always left on the windowsill. The table filled with small sounds and quick exchanges that deepened like colors in a sketch. Claire asked about Sophie. Ethan answered with a laugh that became softer when he said the name. Sophie chimed in with details about school and a teacher named Priya who baked cookies for rainy days. The barista Miguel waved from behind the counter and called out that he had saved them a cinnamon roll. A passerby named Nora peered in, recognized Ethan, and waved. These extra lives overlapped with the conversation in small human stitches. Then Sophie climbed into Claire's lap without invitation, pressed the drawing into her palms, and waited. The room waited. Claire read the crayon lines as if they were a map to some place she had once lost. Ethan explained how he improvised that story the night Sophie had cried for the mother she barely remembered. He spoke haltingly, saying that stories had helped Sophie sleep through storms, and that the woman in the tale had no name until Sophie decided to call her Mama Sun. Claire listened, each word rearranging the assumption she had come with. For a moment, the coffee shop faded into background texture, and the world narrowed to a small square of paper and a child who believed a tale could be true. If you are feeling this warmth right now, know that you are not alone. Pause a second and think of one word that captures a story you remember from childhood. Maybe write it in the comments. We want to build a place where small memories remind us how connection begins. Tell us a word that says everything for you. One word that brings back the smell of soup, the shape of a hand, the sound of your name spoken with tenderness. Your words will knit into a thread that other viewers can follow when they feel lost. This channel has always been about sharing the tiny gestures that expand into family. If you are moved by this moment, say it below. Your comment might be the reason someone else decides to stay. The moment after the comments breathed like the pause before a tide. Claire stacked the paper on the table, folded it once more, and said quietly, "I did not expect this." Ethan smiled and said, "Neither did I." And Sophie announced that Claire was pretty much the best person in the whole story world. From there, the conversation grew roots. They spoke of morning routines, of how Sophie liked to mix cereal with raisins for crunch and surprise, as she explained, of how Claire made a maple streusel that people said kept them talking. The dialogue moved in short bursts, 8 to 10 turns each, where each reply carried more truth and more small gestures. Claire asked, "Where do you make your pieces?" And Ethan said, "Down on Harbor Lane, where the storefront is small but full of sunlight." Claire asked about the birds on his windowsill, and Ethan explained the habit of leaving a carved bird for anyone who needed one. They traded glances that measured possibility. It was not an immediate swoop into romance. Instead, it was a layering of tiny trusts. While it had started, in the coffee shop, the real impression came when Ethan invited them to his workshop a few days later. The shop was a narrow room above an old bakery, light slicing through dust motes like 1,000 shy suns. The smell of wood shavings and lemon oil was stronger there, alongside the faint metallic tang of tools. Claire ran a hand across a stack of pine planks, feeling the grain like the ridges of a familiar map. Sophie sat cross-legged on an upended crate, reading a picture book, humming the melody Ethan had taught her for bedtime. The scene required more sensory lines than the coffee shop offered. There was the sound of a plane passing far above, like a distant punctuation. The texture of an old workbench was rough under Claire's palm. The warmth of an afternoon sun patch made a soft rectangle on the floor. Ethan picked up a small block of cherry wood and began to shape it, the rasp of his tool a companion sound to their conversation. Their exchanges in the workshop moved with the intimacy of people learning to touch each other suture by careful suture. Claire asked about finishing oils. Ethan demonstrated, rubbing a cloth in slow circles, and she leaned in to see how the wood absorbed light. They spoke 8 to 10 times in a row, each exchange stuffed with small revelations. At one point, Claire laughed at a memory Ethan shared of his grandmother Ruth forgetting where she put a spoon and finding it in the teapot. Later, Carlos, a neighbor who did upholstery, came in with an old rocking chair to be restored. Lena, who taught pottery at the community center, dropped off a mug and stayed to watch. Marcus, the mentor who had taught Ethan years before, called from the bench and left a message about a community fair. Each named person became a palpable presence. Their movements and mentions anchored the scene, showed a network of care that Claire had not assumed existed. When they returned from the workshop to the small town green, the first tension of the story began to take shape. It was a moment that felt less like drama and more like a test of edges. An acquaintance from Claire's world named Vanessa had seen them walking and approached with an arched smile that carried the weight of polite evaluation. Vanessa asked with a tilt, "So you are seeing someone who builds things with his hands? How practical." Claire felt the old familiar tug to justify, to explain, to protect her own carefully maintained image. The exchange that followed was compact but sharp. Vanessa pressed about social circles and status, and Ethan responded with a calm that was almost like armor, saying that he did not measure people by their resumes. Claire found herself unexpectedly defensive. She answered in a way that surprised her, telling Vanessa that hands that made things produced more honest marks than any title. The tension sat between them like a cold stone. It lasted only a few breaths, but it tested whether the new connection would bend under outside judgment. It also revealed who Claire wanted to be when people watched. After that, they faced a second test that was quieter but no less significant. On a warm evening, they accepted an invitation to dinner at Claire's friend Nora's house. The table was set with candles and a stew that smelled like memory. Nora asked questions about plans and preferences with a curiosity that felt invasive. In a sequence of 8 to 10 exchanges, the conversation shifted to a place where Claire felt exposed. Someone mentioned the idea of a conventional family and whether it was realistic to expect quick answers after loss. Ethan listened, and then he told, with a voice that trembled around the edges, how Sophie had started sleeping through nights because of a story and a carved bird left on her windowsill. The narrative moved everyone around the table. Marcus, who had come along, rested his hand lightly on Ethan's arm. Priya, the teacher, nodded with water in her eyes. The moment held them tight and then released them, but not without leaving a bruise of vulnerability that required time to soothe. The third moment of real crisis arrived in a way that felt sudden and private. Claire and Ethan had begun to sketch out a kind of shared routine, small predictions of grocery lists and who would fetch Sophie on Wednesday. Then Claire received a message from her ex-husband that reopened an old seam. The message referenced custody and money, and did so with a cold legal clarity that made the air thicken. She felt old fears fold into the present like a paper bird. She considered retreat, asked herself if solitude was a safer harbor than the risk of being vulnerable. In 2 short paragraphs of inward dialogue, she imagined packing and leaving. But then she saw Sophie asleep with a crayon smudge on her cheek and the carved bird on the nightstand. She remembered Ethan's steady patience and the way he hummed stories into the bed. Those images pressed toward a decision. The crisis was less theatrical than it was true to life, a decision between the comfort of what was known and the uncertainty of what might become a chosen family. The silence after the crisis was its own character. Claire stepped back into her apartment and found the rooms too neat, every cushion in place as if mocking the disorder in her chest. She baked a loaf of bread and set it on the counter, but the act of arranging crumbs felt like ritual rather than repair. Her neighbor, Mr. Patel, knocked and left a note about a package, small kindnesses piling up like mail. Friends called. Marcus texted a quote about courage.
Claire realized the weight of the choice had shifted from fear to responsibility. The days that followed were heavy with introspection. She withdrew from some invitations and accepted others. Ethan sent a message asking if she was all right and whether he could bring over soup. She refused at first and then accepted, ashamed to admit that her refusal was less about the soup and more about the admission of needing someone. The reconciliation began with a small, deliberate act. Claire arrived at Ethan's shop not to beg, but to offer something true. She carried a box of spices and a recipe she had kept from a grandmother who taught her to make a particular kind of lentil soup. They sat over a workbench and read through measurements and memories, trading stories of people who had taught them how to be generous. Their conversation in that moment had the precise density of 8 to 10 exchanges, each one a tender stitch. Ethan wrapped his hand around hers to study a spoon, and Claire felt the vulnerability transform into an intention. They spoke about what it would mean to merge two lives that had both known loss. Sophie, seeing their hands close over the same bowl, carved a small bird out of scrap wood and pressed it into Claire's palm like a vote of confidence. They decided to try a practice rather than an instant commitment. They instituted a Saturday ritual where Claire would bring stew and Ethan would show Claire a new carving, and Sophie would plan a little performance at each meal. It was a way to test rhythm and to measure love in the quantities of daily acts. The neighbors noticed the change. Carlos dropped off a repaired stool and said it felt like the block was getting warmer. Lena organized a small pottery exchange and invited everyone. Marcus suggested they host a community fair where people could exchange small repairs and stories. The choice felt like the slow building of a bridge, each plank placed only after careful consideration. 1 month later, life had begun to settle into the soft outlines of new routine. Sophie had learned Claire's way of arranging napkins into little suns. Ruth, the grandmother, stopped by with a thermos and a list of old carpentry jokes that made everyone laugh. Nora brought over a batch of cookies and left a note that said it was good to see Claire smile. The shop on Harbor Lane had begun hosting a small corner for children's drawings, and Sophie proudly taped one to the wall. Claire had started offering a pop-up pastry table at the community market, and people came by not just for the pastries, but to see the woman who had become part of a tiny, improvised family. The community reaction was warm. Priya volunteered to read stories at the fair. Carlos helped set up a bench outside the shop. The project that had once been Ethan's solitary workshop now bore the imprint of many hands. 3 months later, the rhythm had deepened into a language. Claire and Ethan had learned to name things aloud that once felt only interior. They had a little calendar coordinated on the fridge that Sophie loved to rearrange with stickers. Marcus had donated a set of tools and organized a free class for teenagers to learn woodwork. Lena started an after-school pottery club in the space above the bakery. The town fair they hosted drew neighbors and strangers. People left with small carved birds and pastries wrapped in waxed paper. The reactions among the supporting cast were tangible. Priya said that kids in her class slept better after hearing about Mama's son. Ruth kept passing by the shop and adding small quilts on the bench. Vanessa, who had once raised her eyebrows, came with her own niece to learn how to make a shelf. The transformation had the texture of many small hands shaping one larger shape. 6 months in, the change was no longer a rumor but a visible fact. The workshop had a small sign now that read, "The Harbor Workshop and Stories Table." They had started a Saturday morning program where Claire taught children to bake simple breads and Ethan taught them to sand and finish small wooden toys. Sophie had a corner with a cushion and a little library that included the very first drawing she had given Claire, now laminated and framed. The town bank had offered a small grant to help expand the community classes. And Marcus and Carlos organized a fundraiser that brought people from neighboring towns. Emma from the café started bringing leftover pastries to the workshop for the program. The local paper ran a human interest piece that named the project a model of community care. Reactions poured in. People said that seeing a family form slowly made them feel braver.
Neighbors like Priya and Ruth spoke at a small ribbon cutting, and Nora recorded a short video thanking everyone for showing up. On a still evening, with a soft rain tapping at the windows and the shop lamp making the wood glow, Claire stood by the workbench and traced the grain of a tiny bird. She remembered the moment she almost left that first date and the sudden pile of choices that followed. She thought about the voices that had become part of each day, about Marcus dropping off old tools and Priya bringing in storybooks and Miguel offering free coffee during the workshop mornings. She understood finally that family could be built and rebuilt with tools, recipes, stories, and relentless listening. The drawing Sophie had made was now framed on the wall, a simple sun that had lit away into a shared life. If this story touched something in you, consider subscribing. We share stories about real people making brave, loving choices in ordinary places. Subscribing helps us tell more of these narratives and supports neighbors and small projects trying to make space for community. If you want to help others find these stories, leave one word below that tells the story you carry. Your one word might be the bridge someone else needs. Remember that the family you need can sometimes be the one you choose, and sometimes it chooses you back.